This story is titled, I Paid for My Sister's Honeymoon with Her New Fiancé for $8,600, only to have her call me loser at family dinner and say it was cheap. I got angry and cut them off. Hi everyone, before we dive in, a quick favor. If you enjoy content like this, please hit the subscribe button. It's free, supports the channel, and make sure you never miss out on amazing videos. Alright, let's get started. Alright, so let me just say this up front. I'm not the kind of guy who goes around throwing money at people. I've always been responsible with my finances. Bills paid on time, savings in check, no nonsense. But when it comes to family, sometimes you end up doing stuff that doesn't make much sense, and that's where my story begins. My sister Sabrina, 31 female, has always been, let's call it high maintenance. I'm Marcus, 32 male, and for as long as I can remember, she's been the type to take a mile when you give her an inch. But hey, she's my sister, so I've always tried to look out for her. Let me set the scene for you. Sabrina was very spoiled when we were kids, and she had everything given to her on a liver plate. But when we grew up, I met my wonderful now wife and went on great with my marriage. However, Sabrina hasn't exactly had the smoothest ride when it comes to relationships. Her first marriage to Derek, total disaster. Derek was one of those guys who treated having a job like it was an optional hobby. Most of their marriage, he was either glued to the TV or lost in some video game, while Sabrina was out there busting her butt to keep the lights on. I tried warning her plenty of times that he wasn't good for her, but every time she'd hit me with, "You just don't understand him, Marcus." Yeah, sure, I didn't understand how a man could be that lazy, but I let it go. When they finally got divorced, I was honestly relieved, for her and for all of us. But I also felt bad for her going through this because she seemed broken. Then along came Carter, 34 million. At first, I thought this guy was the complete opposite of Derek. He's got a solid job in finance, seems polite, and doesn't give off the "I'm going to live off my wife's income" vibe. Sabrina met him at some networking event, and before I knew it, she was head over heels. Within 6 months, they were engaged. 6 months. It was fast, but Sabrina's always been impulsive, so I wasn't too surprised. Carter seemed decent enough, so I kept my opinions to myself. The wedding planning was a whole thing, as you can imagine. Sabrina went full bridezilla, which honestly wasn't a shock. She had spreadsheets, Pinterest wedding vibes, the works. I contributed a little money toward the wedding and gave them a nice check, because why not? I was only doing my part. I figured that would be the extent of my involvement. Boy, was I wrong. About a month before the wedding, Sabrina called me. Now, let me just say, when Sabrina calls, it's usually because she needs something. This time was no different. She started off all sweet, asking how I was doing, how work was going, blah blah. Then she said, "Carter and I are planning our honeymoon, but we've hit a little snag. I was wondering if you could help us out." I asked what she meant by help. In my mind, I thought maybe she needed advice or a small loan. But it turns out she wanted me to pay for the whole thing. The honeymoon she had in mind wasn't some budget-friendly getaway either. Oh no, Sabrina had her sights set on Italy. 10 days of fancy villas, gondola rides in Venice, the whole 9 yards. I was about to tell her flat out that I couldn't afford to drop that kind of money. But she noticed I'm hesitant and continued, "Marcus, this is really important to us," she said, laying it on thick. "This is our honeymoon. It's a thing I've been dreaming of since my first marriage. I wouldn't ask if it didn't mean a lot to me." I figured Sabrina had been through enough with Derek, and Carter actually seemed like a decent guy. Maybe this was her chance to finally catch a break, and I wanted her to enjoy something for once. So I told her I'd help out, assuming I'd just cover whatever small amount they couldn't manage. Yeah, no. Sabrina sent me the itinerary, and the total? $8,600. $8,600. I'll be honest, I almost backed out. That's a ton of money. But Sabrina pulled out all the stops. She went on about how much this meant to her, how it was a once-in-a-lifetime trip, how she couldn't believe I'd even hesitate. At the end of the day, I gave in. I wired the money, and just like that, Sabrina and Carter's Italian dream honeymoon was fully paid for by yours truly. Now, here's where things started to feel weird. Sabrina is obsessed with social media. Like, if she goes to a coffee shop, you're going to see a picture of her latte with some cheesy caption like, "Living my best life." But during the honeymoon, radio silence. No posts, no stories, nothing. My wife even commented on it. "Isn't it weird Sabrina hasn't posted anything from Italy?" she asked. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe they were just trying to enjoy the moment. When they got back, I was genuinely excited to hear about the trip. We had a family dinner planned at my parents' house. Me, my wife, Sabrina, Carter, and our parents. I figured this would be the perfect opportunity for Sabrina to finally say thank you and tell me all about the amazing time they had. I even thought, maybe this will bring us closer. Maybe she'll finally see I'm not the bad guy she always makes me out to be. That dinner is where everything started to unravel, and I had no idea it was about to turn into the biggest headache of my life. The dinner started off normal enough. My parents had made a big spread, the kind they always put together when all of us are in one place. I showed up with my wife, and Sabrina and Carter were already there. Sabrina was scrolling on her phone, like always, and Carter was just sitting there, looking pretty relaxed. I figured, okay, maybe this will go smoothly. We all sat down, passed the food around, and my mom started asking the usual questions. How was the trip? Did you see all the places you wanted to see? Was the food amazing? You know, small talk. Carter jumped in right away, talking about how beautiful Venice was and how much they loved the gondola rides. He said the food was incredible and that the whole thing was an experience to remember. As he was talking, I couldn't help but notice that Sabrina wasn't saying much. Normally, she'd be the one dominating the conversation, but this time she just sat there, scrolling on her phone like she didn't go with Carter. I thought, okay, maybe she's just tired. My mom chimed in, Marcus really went all out for you two. That trip sounds amazing. Carter nodded, smiling, and said, it really was. We're super grateful for everything. It was a once-in-a-lifetime kind of trip. Finally, I thought. Someone's acknowledging the effort I put in. But then Sabrina, without even looking up from her phone, said, a once-in-a-lifetime trip? I mean, it was fine. Fine. That's the word she used. I sat there, trying to process it, thinking maybe I misheard her. My dad, trying to lighten the mood, said, well, it sounds like it was better than just fine. Those gondola rides must have been amazing. That's when Sabrina put her phone down, looked around the table, and said, honestly, it could have been better. 10 days isn't enough to see Italy properly. And some of the places we went to were basic. Basic? I'm sitting there. My wife's giving me the side eye, and my mom's got this awkward smile like she's trying to smooth things over. Meanwhile, Carter looks like he wants to sink into his chair. I couldn't hold back anymore. Basic, I said. I spent $8,600 on that trip. What exactly wasn't good enough for you? And that's when she hit me with, honestly, Marcus, if all you're that cheap, maybe you should have just saved your money. What kind of person brags about sending someone on a budget vacation? The entire table went silent. My wife put her fork down mid-bite, and my dad, who usually tries to mediate these things, just sat there staring at her. For a second, I thought I'd misheard her. Did she seriously just said that I was too cheap after I dropped nearly $9,000 on what most people would consider a dream trip? You've got to be joking, I said, my voice rising. You think that trip was a budget vacation? Sabrina sighed, like I was the one being unreasonable. Look, Marcus, I'm just saying, when people go on honeymoons, they go all out. They don't just do 10 days in one country and call it luxury. Some of the hotels you booked were average at best, and half the restaurants weren't even memorable. It's like you just Googled top tourist spots and called it a day. I stared at her, trying to wrap my head around what I was hearing. Average at best? Sabrina, I paid for flights, luxury villas, vineyard tours, private gondola rides, the whole deal. What more did you expect? A yacht tour? A Michelin star chef at every meal? A red carpet rolled out at every stop? She rolled her eyes like I was the one being dramatic. I'm not saying it was terrible, but let's not act like you did us some huge favor. If you couldn't afford to plan a proper trip, you shouldn't have tried. Honestly, it was kind of embarrassing telling people you paid for it. They would think my brother is such a loser because it didn't scream amazing. Loser? That word had me going nuts. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, pointed across the table, and said, you know what's embarrassing? The fact that you don't even have the decency to say thank you. The fact that I spent $8,600 to give you and Carter a honeymoon most people only dream of, and all you can do is sit here and criticize me like I owe you something? That's what's embarrassing. Carter, who had been sitting there quietly, finally spoke up. Sabrina, maybe you should... But she cut him off before he could finish. Don't! She snapped, waving her hand in his direction. Then she turned back to me. You don't get it, Marcus. This was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. Everyone I know has these amazing, brag-worthy honeymoons, and ours was just fine. It wasn't special. You wouldn't understand because you've never been in my position. Your position? I shot back. What position is that exactly? The position of having someone else pay for your vacation while you sit back and complain about it not being perfect? Give me a break, Sabrina. No matter how much anyone does for you, it's never going to be enough. You're entitled, plain and simple, and I'm done. My mom tried to jump in, saying something about how we shouldn't argue, but I wasn't having it. No, Mom, this isn't just a little disagreement. Sabrina has been taking advantage of people her whole life, and she doesn't appreciate anything anyone does for her. And frankly, It's embarrassing that she can sit here and act like she's the victim. Sabrina stood up, glaring at me. You're so dramatic. I don't know why you're making this such a big deal. Am I? I said, locking eyes with her. Because from where I'm standing, it seems like I'm the only one who's willing to call you out on your behavior. You want to act like a spoiled brat? Fine. But don't expect me to keep playing along. I'm not your personal bank account, and I'm not putting up with this anymore. I grabbed my coat, turned to my wife, and said, We're leaving. My wife didn't say a word. She just got up and followed me out the door. The drive home was quiet, but not in the calm way. It was the kind of quiet where you're so angry, you can't even talk. My wife finally broke the silence. You did the right thing, she said. But seriously, what is wrong with her? She acted like you handed her a gift card to a fast food joint instead of paying for an Italian honeymoon? I don't know, I replied, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. But I'm done. She's not getting another dime from me, and I don't care what her next excuse is. When we got home, I sat on the couch, replaying the whole thing in my head. I mean, how out of touch do you have to be to think spending $8,600 on a trip isn't enough? But after what happened, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let Sabrina walk all over me anymore. She needed to learn that actions have consequences, and if she couldn't appreciate what I'd done for her, then she didn't deserve my help in the future. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. The night after the dinner, my wife and I sat on the couch in silence. I was still fuming about Sabrina's ridiculous behavior, and my wife was scrolling through her phone, probably trying to distract herself. After a while, she put her phone down and looked at me. You know what I don't get? She said. What? I asked, already guessing where this was going. Why didn't Carter say anything? He just sat there, letting her go off on you. I mean, she called you cheap, and he just sat there. I'd been thinking the same thing since we left the dinner. Carter's usually quiet, but this was different. He didn't even try to step in, not even when things got really bad. It was weird, and the more I thought about it, the more it bugged me. I don't know, I said finally. Maybe he didn't want to make it worse. My wife frowned. Worse? It was already a disaster. What was he so scared of? She wasn't wrong, and her words stuck with me. Carter wasn't the confrontational type, sure, but his silence felt strange. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. The next few days passed without a word from Sabrina or Carter. Then, out of nowhere, I got a text from Carter. He's not the type who talks too much. I was confused. He texted me. Hey Marcus, can we talk? Just you and me. I have some things to explain. I stared at my phone for a while, trying to figure out what he could possibly need to explain. After everything that happened at dinner, I wasn't sure I wanted to hear more, but I texted back anyways. Sure, when? Tonight, if you're free. I'll come to you. That felt a little odd. Carter wasn't the type to randomly ask for private talks. I told him to come by after dinner, and sure enough, he showed up around 8 p.m. He looked rough, definitely not the Carter I was used to. We exchanged pleasantries and he sat on the couch, fidgeting with his wedding ring. For a minute, I thought he wasn't going to say anything. Then he let out a deep breath and said, I owe you an apology. For what? I asked. For Sabrina, he said, and for not standing up for you at dinner. You didn't deserve that. I appreciated the sentiment, but I wasn't about to let him off that easy. So why didn't you say anything? I asked. You just sat there while she tore into me. He hesitated, then said, because things haven't been good between me and Sabrina. I didn't want to make it worse, and that honeymoon, it was supposed to be a reset, he said, for our marriage. What do you mean rest? You have been married for less than a month? I asked, leaning forward. He sighed and rubbed his face. Well, she's been difficult. Planning the wedding was a nightmare. She ignored every budget I set, went way overboard, and threw a fit whenever I tried to rein her in. I thought it was just wedding stress, but after we got married, it didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. I stayed quiet, letting him talk. She started accusing me of not loving her enough, said I didn't do enough to make her feel special. Then she started talking about the honeymoon. I thought maybe if we got away from it all, she'd calm down. That's when she suggested asking you for help. She said you owed her for not being there for her growing up. Hearing that stung, but I wasn't totally shocked. Sabrina always had a knack for twisting the truth. I went along with it because I thought it would make her happy, Carter continued. But by the third day of the honeymoon, she was already complaining. The villas weren't big enough. The gondola rides were too touristy. It didn't matter what we did. Nothing was good enough for her. I shook my head. That's classic Sabrina. I'm filing for divorce, he said. I didn't expect that to come. Divorce already? I said. He must have seen the shock on my face because he laughed bitterly. I know how it sounds. Believe me, I thought I could fix it. I thought maybe if I tried harder, Sabrina would change. It got worse, he said, looking down at his hands. I found out she's been texting Derek. Wait, what? I said, sitting up straight. He nodded. I caught her texting him right before the wedding. She told me it was harmless, that they were just friends, and I believed her. But then, last week, I found more texts. She's been venting to him about me since before we even got married, telling him I'm not man enough for her, that I don't make her feel loved, stuff like that. I didn't even know how to respond. And you stayed? I asked finally. He shrugged. But after the honeymoon, and then the dinner, I don't think I can do this anymore. But I didn't tell her about the divorce yet. For a moment, I didn't know whether to feel bad for him or angry at Sabrina. On one hand, he didn't deserve this. But on the other hand, Sabrina's behavior wasn't exactly a secret. He knew what he was getting into, at least to some degree. I told him he needed to do what was best for himself, but I also warned him not to let Sabrina manipulate him. I explained how good she was at making people feel guilty and dragging things out if given the chance. He nodded, but it was clear he wasn't entirely convinced. He apologized again for what happened at dinner, saying I didn't deserve the way Sabrina treated me. I reassured him it wasn't his fault and told him he deserved better than what she was putting him through, whether he decided to stay or leave. Carter stayed a little longer, but the conversation didn't really go anywhere after that. Once he left, I couldn't stop replaying everything he'd told me. Sabrina had always been selfish, but this was on another level. It was clear now. Her problems weren't just mine anymore. They were Carter's too. After Carter left, I couldn't stop replaying our conversation. Sabrina's antics weren't surprising, but the details he shared, the constant complaints, the texts with Derek, painted an even worse picture than I imagined. I was still stewing over it the next morning when my wife brought it up over coffee. So, what did Carter say last night? She asked casually, though I could tell she was genuinely curious. I debated how much to share. Basically, he said their relationship is a mess, I replied. She's been making his life miserable and he's planning to file for divorce. That's when my mom called me. Sabrina's here, she said without preamble. She's been crying since she arrived, and I think you two need to talk. Typical. Sabrina's go-to move when things didn't go her way was to cry until someone felt bad enough to fix it for her. I told my mom I'd think about it, then hung up. My wife raised an eyebrow when I told her. Are you actually going to go? She asked. I shrugged. Might as well. If nothing else, I can finally tell her what I think. When I got to my parents' house, Sabrina was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. She looked like she'd been there a while, and my mom hovered nearby, probably hoping to referee the conversation. Sabrina didn't say anything when I walked in, so I sat down across from her and waited. Finally, she spoke. I'm sorry for what I said at dinner. I stayed silent looking at her. For crossing the line, she continued looking down. I didn't mean to be so rude to you. It was an apology, but it wasn't enough. Not after everything Carter told me. Carter came to see me last night, I said. He told me about the honeymoon, and the arguments, and Derek. Her head snapped up at that last part. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, like she wasn't sure what to say. Finally, she sighed. I didn't mean for it to get this bad. Get what bad? I asked. Everything, she said, waving a hand vaguely. I thought marriage would fix things. I thought if we had this perfect wedding and this amazing honeymoon, everything would be okay. But it wasn't. No kidding, I said. That's not how it works, Sabrina. A wedding and a trip don't fix anything. And texting Derek? What the hell were you thinking? Her face reddened, but she didn't deny it. It wasn't like that, she insisted. I just needed someone to vent to. Derek was going through a divorce, and I thought he'd understand. Vent? I repeated. You told him Carter wasn't man enough for you. How is that venting? That's sabotage. She opened her mouth to argue, but stopped short. Instead, she dropped her head into her hands and started crying. They didn't seem like crocodile tears, but I wasn't sure. I don't know what's wrong with me, she said between sobs. I'm ruining everything. First Derek, now Carter. I don't even know who I am anymore. I wanted to feel bad for her, but honestly, I was too frustrated. You're selfish, Sabrina, I said bluntly. You've been selfish for years. You expect everyone else to fix your problems, and when they don't, you lash out. This isn't about Carter or me. It's about you. She nodded, still crying, but I wasn't done. I can't fix this for you, I continued. You've got to figure it out yourself. And let me make one thing clear. I'm done bailing you out. You've had chance after chance to take responsibility, and you've blown every one of them. And if Carter leaves you, do not come to me to drag me down with you anymore. She wiped her face with her sleeve and nodded again. I understand, she said quietly. That was a bit weird. For the first time, she didn't argue, but believing her didn't mean I trusted her. My mom, who'd been lingering in the background, stepped in at that point, trying to smooth things over. It's good you two talked, she said gently, as if that would magically fix everything. I stood up, shaking my head. Sure, Mom, but this doesn't change anything. Sabrina needs to figure this out on her own. On my way out, my mom stopped me in the hallway. That was hard, she said softly. It had to be, I replied. If I keep saving her, she'll never learn. When I got home, I dropped onto the couch, feeling a mix of exhaustion and disgust. Sabrina had apologized, but the weight of everything Carter had told me was still sitting heavy. The fact that she was still talking to Derek, her ex, after everything, venting about Carter no less, was just gross. It wasn't just disrespectful to Carter. It showed how little she valued the relationship she claimed to care about. For once, though, I didn't feel like it was my problem to fix. I'd made it clear that she needed to figure things out on her own. No more bailing her out, no more getting dragged into her chaos. I couldn't ignore her history of making promises she never kept, and part of me doubted this time would be any different. Still, at least I'd drawn a line. Whether she fixed things with Carter or let it all implode, it was finally her mess to deal with. I couldn't shake the disgust, though. The way she could just carry on with Derek like it was no big deal. It was selfish, manipulative, and honestly, it made me question if she was capable of real change. But I'm honestly done letting her choices control my life. Whatever would happen next is on her, and that's the way it should have been all along. What do you guys think? Am I being too harsh on her? Update 1. Hey everyone, just wanted to give an update since a lot has happened. After I made the decision to completely step back from Sabrina's mess, I'd set my boundaries, and whether she figured things out or not wasn't my responsibility anymore. But, in true Sabrina fashion, she found a way to pull everyone back into her orbit. About a week later, my mom called me to ask if I'd talked to Sabrina. I hadn't, and I told her I didn't plan to, unless it was something important. Mom mentioned that Sabrina had deactivated all her social media accounts and claimed she just needed a break. Mom sounded worried, but I figured Sabrina was either embarrassed or plotting her next move. Not long after that, I got a text from Carter. He said they'd started counseling and were trying to work things out, though he wasn't sure if it would help. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't respond. On one hand, I respected that he was trying, but on the other, I doubted counseling would magically change who Sabrina is. Even though I'd drawn my line, I couldn't help but wonder what was going on. One afternoon, I checked Sabrina's social media. Sure enough, it was all gone. Instagram, Facebook, even Snapchat. That was weird for Sabrina, who lives for attention and showing off. Carter's social media was still private, but his bio had changed. It now had some vague line about starting over and moving forward. I couldn't tell if that meant he was planning to leave her, or if it was just some generic motivational quote. Either way, it didn't tell me much. Then Mom called again. She told me Sabrina was staying at their house because she and Carter were taking a break. From what Mom said, it was clear Sabrina hadn't been told about the divorce yet. If she had, Mom would have known. Mom also said Sabrina was unusually quiet and seemed withdrawn. Mom suggested I check in on her, but I told her no. I'd made it clear I wasn't fixing Sabrina's problems anymore. Mom, ever the peacekeeper, said Sabrina wasn't asking for anything and just seemed lost. That stuck with me. Sabrina being quiet and lost? That wasn't the Sabrina I knew. She was usually loud, dramatic, and full of excuses. The next day, I stopped by my parents' house. Sabrina was on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, staring blankly at the TV. She didn't even acknowledge me when I walked in. It wasn't the dramatic meltdown I expected. It was almost unsettling how subdued she was. When I asked what was going on, she admitted that Carter had moved out and said he needed space to figure things out. She wasn't angry or defensive, just defeated. It was jarring. For Sabrina, a tantrum would have been more normal. She told me she was trying to figure things out, but didn't know where to start. There was no mention of counseling, no plan, no direction. She seemed completely adrift. For the first time, she wasn't blaming anyone else. Just her admitting that she didn't have it together. When I asked if she thought counseling would help, she hesitated and said she didn't think so. She didn't believe Carter wanted to fix things anymore, and wasn't even sure if she did. That honesty, as sad as it was, felt like a breakthrough. She told me she was trying not to mess up everything she touched. That hit harder than I expected. Sabrina had always been the one pointing fingers, but now it felt like she was starting to see that the problem wasn't just other people, it was her. I told her, as plainly as I could, that fixing this was on her. Nobody could do it for her, and if she didn't take responsibility, things would only get worse. She just nodded. When I left, I felt something I hadn't felt in a while. Relief. Sabrina wasn't magically better, and I wasn't naive enough to think she'd suddenly turn her life around. But for the first time, it felt like she understood she couldn't keep blaming everyone else for her problems. Whether she and Carter worked things out or not doesn't matter to me anymore. Whether she fixes her life or keeps spiraling was entirely her decision. I'm not carrying her problems anymore, and honestly, that felt freeing. Final update. Hey everyone. I didn't think I'd be back with an update, but here we are. I wish I could say things got better, but if anything, they've gone in the opposite direction. I stuck to my guns, but it turns out Not everyone in the family was on the same page. And now we're in a full-blown mess. First off, Carter went through with the divorce. He packed up, left town, and hasn't looked back. Honestly, I don't blame him. The guy put up with way more than anyone should. Sabrina, of course, was devastated, or at least she acted like she was. At first, my parents were sympathetic. They're the help everyone, no matter what type, especially my mom. I told them Sabrina needed to figure things out on her own million times, but they didn't want to hear it. My mom kept saying things like, she's going through a lot right now, and family is supposed to be there for each other. Sure, family helps, but there's a line, and Sabrina's been crossing it for years. I reminded them that she's an adult, and this was the perfect opportunity for her to take responsibility and make some real changes. My dad seemed to agree at first, but my mom wasn't having it. She insisted that Sabrina just needed time to get back on her feet. The problem? Sabrina wasn't interested in getting back on her feet. She was comfortable. My parents gave her a free place to stay, cooked for her, and even started giving her a little money to cover things like groceries. When I found out, I wasn't surprised but still pissed. I told them they were enabling her, and my mom just brushed me off, saying it was temporary. But here's the thing they didn't expect. Temporary turned into a full-blown cash flow. A few weeks later, my mom casually mentioned that they'd loaned Sabrina some money for her rent. I was like, "Rent? I thought she was staying with you." Turns out, Sabrina had decided to move back into her old apartment because she needed space to heal. My parents covered her first 2 months of rent because she wasn't ready to go back to work yet. I lost it. I told my mom straight up that they were rewarding her bad behavior. She wasn't working, wasn't trying to find a job, and had no plan. She was just leeching off them like she always does. My mom said I was being harsh, and reminded me that Sabrina was going through a divorce. Divorce or not, she's a grown woman, I told her. You're not helping her. You're just making it easier for her to keep screwing up. My dad stayed quiet through all of this, which pissed me off even more. I could tell he didn't entirely agree with my mom, but he wasn't willing to stand up to her, or to Sabrina. It didn't take long for things to escalate. Sabrina started asking for more money, and my parents kept giving it to her. I found out she'd convinced them to pay for some kind of self-care retreat, because she needed to find herself after everything she'd been through. I'm not talking about a weekend at a cheap spa. This was a full week at some luxury wellness center. When I confronted my mom about it, she said Sabrina promised to pay them back once she got on her feet. I couldn't even believe what I was hearing. She's never paid anyone back in her life, I reminded her. Why would this time be any different? My mom told me I was being negative and that I needed to support my sister during this difficult time. That's when I realized we weren't just on different pages. We were in entirely different worlds. The breaking point came when Sabrina started calling me again. She said she wanted to talk things out and repair our relationship. I thought maybe she was finally ready to take accountability, but no. She wanted money. As if I didn't tell her not to expect me that I won't help her. She started with some sob story about how her car broke down and she couldn't afford to fix it. I told her to basically fuck off. That's when she really went off. She accused me of being selfish, of not being a good brother, and of abandoning her when she needed me most. I told her flat out that she'd already burned that bridge and that I wasn't going to let her manipulate me like she does with mom and dad. She must have gone straight to them after we hung up, because the next day, my mom called me and said I needed to let go of the past and give Sabrina another chance. I told her this had nothing to do with the past. It was about her ongoing pattern of behavior. Things got ugly after that. My mom accused me of being heartless, and I told her she was being naive. I pointed out that Sabrina had made no real effort to change. She wasn't working, wasn't paying her own bills, and was just using them as a safety net. My dad tried to mediate, but he ended up taking my mom's side, saying they couldn't just turn their backs on her. That was it for me. I told them I wasn't going to be part of this anymore. If they wanted to keep enabling her, that was their choice, but I wasn't going to stick around and watch. I made it clear that Sabrina was cut off completely. No money, no favors, no emotional support. Nothing. Since then, things have been tense. I've distanced myself from my parents, which sucks because I used to be really close to them. But every time I talk to them, it's the same argument over and over. They keep defending Sabrina, and I keep reminding them that they're only making things worse. It's like talking to a wall. As for Sabrina, she's still doing the same thing she's always done, taking and taking without giving anything back and not even appreciating. I've heard through the grapevine, aka my aunt, that she started asking other family members for money now that I've shut her down. Apparently, she's already borrowed from my aunt and one of our cousins, with no plans to pay them back either. It's exhausting. Cutting Sabrina off was the right thing to do, but watching my parents dig themselves deeper into her mess has been hard. At this point, I'm focusing on protecting my own peace. If they want to keep letting her take advantage of them, that's their choice, and I don't give a shit about it anymore. Thanks to everyone who encouraged me to set boundaries last time. It's been tough, but I know I made the right decision. Hopefully one day, my parents will see it too.